Welcome to America Walk's PED Talks, in which we discuss cutting-edge issues of social justice, community design, and walkability with national and neighborhood-level thought leaders. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Destiny Thomas, community organizer, cultural anthropologist, and urban planner from Oakland, California, and also the founder and CEO of the Thrivance Group. Destiny, what's the vision of the Thrivance Group?
Thank you for having me, first of all, Ian. I'm really excited to be here. I think we're both Dr. Thomas, so thank you for having me, Dr. Thomas. The vision for the Thrivance Group is pretty straightforward to us, although I'm hearing it's kind of cutting edge for our field. So the Thrivance Group, actually the word Thrivance stems from this theory called Thrivance theory, which I began working on in 2011 at the beginning of my doctoral studies. And the long story short is that through my research and efforts to do interviews with people who had experienced trauma in the built environment, I found that I was constantly encountering like secondary and sometimes even primary harm myself. And so in doing my own healing work, I was advised to find a way to do the work without hurting myself, without walking through people's trauma and without asking people to walk through theirs. And as I began to work on this, I encountered, I would say really late in my academic experience, Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, which teaches us that the way a person is perceived by others, the way they experience life, has the way their identity is constructed has a lot to do with the overlapping systems and structures of oppression that establish those identities. And so that was fascinating to me. And I know that we're used to the term intersectionality now, but this was in 2011, and it really resonated with me. But what was troubling was I didn't know how to take that information about the ways people's identities are formed and the ways they're sort of treated by society. I didn't know how to reconcile that with my intention of healing. And so I began to turn intersectionality theory on its literal head and said, well, if there are interlocking ways in which oppression affect our identities, there must be also interlocking ways in which things like joy, things like creativity, sort of construct who we are. And so I'll give an example of it. I am someone who has a learning disability. I'm dyslexic, and intersectionality theory and society tells me that I lose a privilege point by way of that aspect of my identity. But one of the things that are beneficial about being dyslexic is that I'm keen for shapes and shades and colors, and I'm actually an amazing painter and artist. And so that is an example of how we use Thrivance theory to shape how we both study the environment and people and engage and interact with them. So at the Thrivance Group, long story short, we like to meet people at the intersection of where they thrive while we are recommending policies and infrastructure for their use.
Great. So before we dive into the details, I'd like to learn a little bit more about Destiny Thomas. So please tell us your personal story and how your lived experiences have informed the way that you look at the world.
Yeah, thank you for asking this question. I rarely get to talk about myself in this way. I am born and raised in Oakland, California. I grew up in the Alameda Unified School District, which is a small island community, literally right next to Oakland. And through that sort of dual experience, that dual lived experience of being somebody living in, less privileged circumstances. I grew up in a housing development of 600 units, low-income people, and having that experience and going to school with classmates that were from other areas that were more well off really helped me to understand my identity at an early age. No one gave me the notion of race or the notion of racism. It was something that I was keen to really early. Like my mother jokes about the fact that I discovered race when I was 5 years old. That informs a lot of my work now, knowing that this thing is something that lands on youth and young people in a certain way is really important to me in my work. But anyway, I went on to attend college in Nashville, Tennessee at Fisk University, which is the first accredited historically Black college in the United States. It is the alma mater of W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm so proud of that. My professor in my writing lab was Nikki Giovanni, and I learned environmental studies from Al Gore. So I want to give people a sense, you know what I'm saying? You know how a person who went to Harvard, an Ivy League school, would be really proud of that background. I feel that way. I went to the Ivy Leagues of Black colleges, and a lot of people don't know that about me. But my first summer home from there, I was sitting on the couch on a Saturday morning watching cartoons because I was still young, eating cereal, and the Alameda County Sheriff's Department enacted a no-knock raid in our apartment complex. And the no-knock raid was connected to the recent sale of our apartment complex to a Florida-based developer who was planning to come in and redevelop. And they caught wind that we weren't planning on moving, that we would fight this, this change. And so the Alameda County Sheriff's Department assisted that developer in researching criminal backgrounds in the community and found that they had justification to show up with battering rams and automatic weapons to people's houses as an act of intimidation. They knew that no one in my apartment had any criminal background or criminal activity. This was an act of intimidation. And I'm bringing this story up because it really cemented in me that I had a place in urban planning. Even before I had the language and the narrative of what urban planning was. I didn't even know that was a career path at the time. Cemented that for me. But I'm also bringing it up because as we wrestle with the recent killing of Breonna Taylor, we know that her family's attorneys, are now including in their lawsuit a very similar tactic, lifting that up as one of the reasons this no-knock raid had even shown up to Breonna Taylor's house. So totally not a tangent and has a lot to do with the fire in my belly. I will never forget that fear, and it is my life's work to make sure that no one else feels it. And then lastly, I'll say, by the time I graduated undergrad, 2 of my closest friends had been killed in car crashes. So much of my trauma had to do with decisions that people made about land use and infrastructure that I knew I needed to insert myself in the work and in these conversations from a point of disruption, from a place of disruption. So I've been disruptive. I've been disrupting in Caltrans as an environmental planner. I was there for almost 4 years. I was definitely a disruptor during my time at Los Angeles Department of Transportation as a transportation planner. And we continue to be disruptive in our work through the Thrivance Group. So that's me in a nutshell. Very complex individual, but I'm someone who unfortunately is living a life in response to trauma and as a reaction to trauma. Haven't got to a place of joy, but I'm working on it.
Thank you for sharing that terrible story of the no-knock raid. Most of us have not experienced that, and it's very meaningful to realize that many people do go through those terrifying experiences.
Very common tactic.
You refer to dignity-infused community engagement and planning in your work. Can you explain how that approach differs from more traditional community engagement and planning processes, and perhaps why it's so important right now?
Yeah. If we think about Thrivance theory and everything that it stands for, and this intention of meeting people at the intersections of the things that cause them to thrive, that's really the core premise of dignity-infused community engagement. What I have found through my planning efforts and through interactions in various communities is that every time we explore this notion of what about your life is thriving, what is causing you to thrive, people tend to respond with things that are heavily anchored to this idea of dignity. And so dignity-infused community engagement is really a framework and a method for project development and planning that centers community. I could very easily call it dignity-infused planning because essentially it's a framework for project development. But we really are centering community voice and community dignity through every stage. So we handle things like accessibility, we handle things like cultural nuance through this work, but we also take on things like anti-displacement as a baseline outcome. We take on things like atonement and reparations as a baseline outcome and intention of a project. And so in praxis, what this looks like is maybe we're not having public meetings where we're pontificating about a project that's already been conceptualized, but instead we have longstanding and deep-rooted relationships in the community, and that our projects themselves are derivatives of the conversations that have been ongoing for so long in those neighborhoods.
Yeah, thank you, Destiny. So I've worked for many years in the area of creating calm streets, livable neighborhoods, safe opportunities for everyone to enjoy the public space. And through that work, I have learned how historic racial injustice has shaped American cities. And I thought I knew a bit about that. But just in the last few months, I've become aware of a much deeper and ongoing reality of what I think people refer to as white supremacy culture that's really baked into our supposedly democratic systems for planning and designing communities. And in this regard, Destiny, you've used a term, purple lining. Could you tell us a little bit more about that concept?
Sure. Purple lining, and obviously I have a thing for words. So purple lining is a term that I came up with as a reckoning back to urban planning's legacy in redlining. So redlining was an intentional and state-sanctioned practice whereby Black people were relegated and limited to housing in certain areas, and those areas were then subsequently deemed worth less, to put it short. And people with closer in proximity to whiteness and white people were relegated in a radial way to other areas. That's actually how suburbs came about. And so purple lining explores the tactics and the intentions and motivations behind redlining, and problematizes or challenges how those tactics are showing up in urban planning and specifically in transportation planning today. And so while purple lining is definitely a reference to transportation planning, it's really a representation of redlining through transportation planning. And what I mean when I say that is purple lining is pretty much this conspiring of local government entities, people with a lot of privilege and voice in public processes, and developers to inform and shape the priorities, the infrastructural priorities in a community, particularly as it pertains to transportation infrastructure. And so one of the most prevalent tactics leveraged in redlining was this subverting of the interests of people who weren't white, of the voices and democratic process of people who weren't white in decisions about housing and land use. That is showing up today in our active transportation advocacy and urban planning work. And so I use the term purple lining to challenge the erasure of of entire groups and communities of people in the democratic and civic engagement process. But I also use that term because I want people to go and read up on this legacy of racism through redlining and find the commonalities in how we are doing the work today.
In this moment, we're all engaged in a vigorous debate about law enforcement. Should we try to reform police departments, or should we conclude that the institution is fatally flawed and start all over again with a brand new, fully inclusive, maybe dignity-infused visioning process about community safety? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, but also, is a similar debate happening in the planning profession? And how does that affect programs like Safe Routes to School and Vision Zero, which have traditionally included a focus on enforcement?
Yeah, I think so. One thing before I say anything that I want to be clear about is that law enforcement happens through more agencies than just police departments, right? So there are multiple agents of enforcement, including departments of transportation. And so when we talk about defunding police or defunding policing, it's important to me that we are thinking about all of the ways in which policing is happening, right? So to your question of whether or not we need to abolish or reform, I think there's some nuance to it, but I think that I firmly believe that we don't have any examples of where enforcement works in any setting, in the urban planning space or otherwise. We also don't have any examples of where incarceration, which is an agent of enforcement, is helpful either. So this notion of punishing people as a way of reinforcing our plans altogether doesn't work. Now you do with that information what you will. But I will say that for the people who are sort of on the spectrum of abolition and not quite there yet, there are some powerful ways that we can begin to reform. And I think that this, the language around divest and invest is a helpful framing for that. So it's not just, okay, get rid of the police and then what? It's what about the actions of the police are we looking to get rid of? And what are we replacing that function with? And so a lot of people have been coming to me and asking me, okay, we know that you are, an abolitionist, right? So would you be okay with automated speed enforcement as an alternative? My answer will always be no, because it's still enforcement, and the inherent racism that's baked into the structural context will still be there. So we have no way for automated enforcement to be to not have those flaws, right? But I will say that if someone could just prove to me that automated enforcement, speed enforcement had a impact on person-to-person police driver or police pedestrian or police bicycle interactions, right? Someone could show me a reduction in those person-to-person contacts, then I would be in favor of a temporary solution like that.
And then what about the planning profession? Are there those sort of similar conversations, whether to abolish or reform? And in particular, I'm interested in your thoughts about the future of Safe Routes to School and Vision Zero.
Yeah, I think that the intentions and values of programs like Safe Routes to School and Vision Zero, both of which I have personal connections to, are very valid and valuable. I think we cheapen them by adding enforcement to an argument that's rooted in engineering as a baseline approach. So our engineering has to be defensible. And we do defend engineering by focusing on equity. We can defend engineering through things like education, you know, but by virtue of what our argument is, that we can save lives and slow speeds and make space and make streetscapes safer for all modes through this sort of progressive engineering, if that is our premise, then enforcement is antithetical to that notion, because what would there be to police? And so I think philosophically, enforcement has no place in these programs to begin with.
Lastly, how can advocates for safe, livable, and walkable neighborhoods, especially those of us who are in the process of acquiring racial literacy at the present time, best support anti-racism efforts?
Great question. I think, again, it depends on where you are in your journey and your walk to being anti-racist. I think a lot of people have been doing the right thing by going and reading, but I think what needs to be coupled with sort of this personal exploration and change is the yielding to people who are already there. And so one of the things that I recommend in a recent publication of mine is the reclassification of urban planning positions in civil service, so that people who are already fully aware of how this work can happen in a different way have access to those jobs and can begin to implement changes right away. I think if you aren't there yet, but are leaning into it, just throw your support and resources behind someone who's ready to do the work, and make sure that that those people that you're supporting are not new to the work themselves and virtue signaling or asking you to support them just because they look like people who have been oppressed. Really do due diligence and make sure that the people you're working with and supporting are adequately trained and have adequate relationships to do the work in a meaningful way.
Destiny, it's been an absolute pleasure to get to know you, and thank you for sharing your thinking with our America Walks audience. Before we wrap up, how can people connect with you, and are there any upcoming events you want to tell us about?
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to get to know you. I'm excited that anyone with the word walks behind them is talking to me. You could find our work at thrivancegroup.com. I do a lot of talking and arguing on Twitter at Dr. Des the Planner, Dr. Des the Planner. But we also have some exciting work happening through our Unurbanist Assembly platform. And in 2021, we'll be actually rolling out a formal plan called CPR-U, which is a comprehensive package for reparations through urbanism. And so that's a campaign, going back to your other question, that our colleagues can get behind.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Destiny Thomas.
Thank you.